In our last Project Street Sleeper video, we took a close look at the centerpiece of our modification plans, the Forced Performance 68 HTA turbocharger. Then we ported and gasket matched our exhaust manifold, turbine housing, and O2 housing. After that was done, we sent it all off to Detective Coating, who worked magic in the form of their beautiful and strong high-heat ceramic coating. Now it's time to bolt it all together and hang it on the engine. Let's get to work. Our first job is to remove our stock turbo, exhaust manifold, and O2 housing. I started by disconnecting the battery and removing the air intake components. This gives us our first glimpse at the small but venerable 14B turbocharger. Next, we drain the coolant and remove the radiator hoses. I'm reusing this coolant since I just flushed the system and added a fresh batch late last summer. If you have a cat, these big kitty litter jugs are perfect for this sort of thing. After I remove the exhaust manifold heat shield, I spray down all of the nuts and bolts with a generous helping of penetrating oil. This is an important step given the torture that this hardware endures over the years. While that was soaking, I removed the power steering pump and bracket, which is necessary to remove the exhaust manifold. After that, I unbolted the radiator hold-down brackets and removed it and the fan assembly from the car. Next, I removed the lower heat shield and then disconnected the oil feed line from the cylinder head and the water feed line bolt from the front of the turbo. Back under the car, I unbolted the stock downpipe and then the turbo's oil drain line bolts. Since I'm removing the turbo, manifold, and O2 housing as one assembly, my final step was loosening the exhaust manifold to cylinder head nuts. It's very common for at least one or two of these to back out of the cylinder head while you're loosening them, so try not to be alarmed. With those nuts removed, we can now pull the turbo assembly up and out of the car. Here's a closer look at the stock turbo setup. An excellent piece of engineering even after 23 years. Here you get a good look at how the exhaust flows out of the engine into the manifold, down into the turbine housing, and then out of the O2 housing. Also, for those that don't know, the Mitsubishi 14B is an amazing little turbo. It offers great potential with the proper supporting mods and porting work. I chose to upgrade my turbo instead of working over the 14B for a few reasons, but for budget builds, a healthy 14B is hard to beat. I thought you'd like to see some shots of the 14B compared to the 68 HTA. Starting with the turbine housings, you can immediately see the size difference between the FP 8cm housing and the stock 6cm housing. The FP unit offers much more internal volume and flow potential. Looking down into the turbine inlet, our ported unit dwarfs the stocker and will obviously flow much better. We can also see a common issue with the stock turbine housing, which is cracking here at the turbine inlet and also at the wastegate outlet. In our case, this stock turbine housing cannot be ported due to the severity of the cracking. Now let's take a look at the compressor housing and rotating assembly. I'm just going to be quiet for a minute and let you check this stuff out. Alright, now it's time to bolt together and install our new turbo assembly. Before doing so, I ordered a handful of parts, including a new 4-layer exhaust manifold gasket, new OEM bolts and washers, new exhaust manifold mounting hardware, and coolant hoses that are easier to replace while the turbo is out of the car. After mating the turbine housing with the center section, my next step was bolting on the O2 housing. I used all new OEM hardware and an OEM gasket that was matched to our port job. I made sure to follow the proper torque specs as seen in the service manual. Next, I bolted up the water line and torqued it to spec. Then I reinstalled the oil line with a new bolt and new crush washers, and then torqued it down. Our final step in preparing the turbo assembly was bolting the exhaust manifold to our turbine housing, once again using the proper OEM hardware. Using new bolts and these specific washers will keep your turbo tightly mated to the manifold for a long time. After torquing those bolts to spec, we can now take a look at this quite handsome turbo assembly before we hide it all in the nose of the Galant. Just take a look at our old turbo setup versus our new one. Not only does it look incredible, it's going to perform great too. I mentioned new coolant hoses earlier. While I had the system drained and the turbo out of the way, it just made sense to replace the turbo coolant line hoses and these oil cooler hoses near the bottom of the engine. Once I got the old hoses out, they were both really squishy and hadn't been touched since the car was built, I'm sure. This is the sort of thing that will fail on you when you're far from home or when you least expect it. Replacing them now is really easy and is one less thing to worry about. I also used this opportunity to replace my most likely original heater hoses with a set of new Mitsubishi replacement hoses. Nothing beats the fit and quality of these parts. This is a very straightforward job, just be careful when removing the hoses from the firewall. These wouldn't budge, so I sliced the hoses with a razor blade, which allowed them to slide right off. After cleaning the pipes with a brass brush, the new ones can be installed and clamped down. With those maintenance items out of the way, my last steps before we could hang the turbo was installing a new oxygen sensor and then installing a new oil drain gasket. I like to use a tiny bit of Right Stuff gasket maker to hold it to the oil drain pipe, so the gasket doesn't move around or get damaged when installing the turbo assembly. Man, what is better than bolting on a new turbo?
Nothing.
Nothing?
No, nothing.
How about puppies and kittens?
No.
Star Wars marathon?
No, I guess not.
Gazing upon your newborn child for the first time?
Close, but no!
Installation of the new assembly is the reverse of removing it all. I reconnected my water and oil lines. And then torqued my exhaust manifold mounting nuts to spec. I picked up this new lower heat shield, but since I was using a 2G DSM-02 housing, I had to make some room for the different oxygen sensor mounting location. Some quick work with the drill and burr bit took care of that. Our final step was installing our stock turbo outlet pipe. Oh man, is this a great sleeper turbo setup or what? I'm sneaky. Thank you for watching. In our next Project Street Sleeper video, we're going to do something about this tiny intercooler. And you know it's going to be real stealthy, so stay tuned for that one. So with that said, thanks again folks, we'll see you next time. I also want to thank ECM Tuning, Detective Coding, and Forced Performance for supporting Tom's Turbo Garage. Please check them out as they not only do great work, they're great people too.